So today we're going to talk a little bit about dreams. And first I want to contextualize this research that I've been developing. In Brazil, in the present context of psychoanalysis, many colleagues argue that it is impossible to articulate the political phenomena and the singularity that is present within the clinical dispositive of psychoanalysis. Usually, when someone tries or attempts to do such articulation, they argue that that would be sociology and not psychoanalysis. And this argument is actually well-based, given that psychoanalysis is strictly interested in the particular subjective response the subject gives to life, or the big other, if you will. However, in my clinical practice, and also outside of my practice being an advocate for minorities, I have comprehended that this way of thinking would only limit psychoanalysis and its treatment. So I've begun this research to apprehend a little bit the worry of those colleagues, but at the same time, to not give myself into it without a precise scrutiny. And I started to think, how could I possibly find a path to articulate the political phenomena and the singularity in the clinic? And as I was rereading the interpretation of dreams of Sigmund Freud, with those political lens of mine, I've started noticing that in the description, in the account of Sigmund Freud in relation to his own dreams and fantasies and experience as an analyst, he would affirmably state that political content would emerge within either the interpretation of dreams, but also the construction, the production of dreams, the neuric production. And that really caught my eye, and I was drawn onto it. And so I started to analyze a dream of Freud's that he himself entitled The Dream of Uncle Joseph. So this dream is first established omitting or dissimulating political content. However, in a second analysis, and I want to underline that the analysis of those dreams are made by Sigmund Freud himself. In the second analysis, he takes these political contents into consideration, and he changes the whole aspect, or if you will, construction of the dream, the interpretation of the dream. In the first analysis, the dream feels almost shallow in relation to the political content, almost as if he's trying to intentionally dissimulate those political contents. However, in the second analysis, he brings them into not a central paper. The central paper here will always be the manifestations of the unconscious, but Sigmund Freud brings the political content as elements that would fortify his interpretation. So my intention in this video is to work with primarily the first interpretation of Sigmund Freud, highlighting or underlining the elements that were omitted or dissimulated or even repressed unconsciously by Sigmund Freud, and then a posteriori I would bring the second analysis of Sigmund Freud of the same dream as an alibi to my interpretation of this specific dream. So first, I have to make a disclaimer. I'm only analyzing this dream given it is a public fact that Sigmund Freud, in his autobiography, has explicitly said that being a Jew would hinder a few of his social and political movements, such as the creation of psychoanalysis itself, but also his ascension as a Jewish man in the 20th century Vienna. And this disclaimer is actually almost a requirement for the analysis of this dream, because I'm taking into consideration the political elements, but also and mainly the historical component of Sigmund Freud's life. So the Uncle Joseph's dream occurred after an event that deeply troubled Sigmund Freud, in which he was nominated extraordinary professor. So on one hand, this nomination would bring a Jewish man of the 20th century Vienna a possibility of ascension, social and political and economic ascension. However, on the other hand, Sigmund Freud was very in disbelief of the possible effectuation of this nomination, because he understood that his Jewish status would hinder the effectuation. So before having this dream, Sigmund Freud was visited by one of his friends called friend R. This friend had already been in the same position as Sigmund Freud, and due to sectarian reasons, he hadn't been officially effectuated in that position. And that only contributed to Freud's disbelief. So I first want to highlight the signifier, sectarian, and I went to the original language in which the book was written, that was German, and I found out that sectarian is translated to sekterisch in German. So Sekti in German means related to cult, and Rich would be related to a person. So Sektrich means someone who is related to a cult. And I want to highlight this specific signifier because it appears repeatedly in Sigmund Freud's narration of the dream. And as we all know, Lacan pays very much attention to the repetition of signifiers, claiming that those repetitions actually mean something else. And so I want to let this signifier aside a little bit to continue the narration. However, this signifier is extremely important for my interpretation of this dream. So Sigmund Freud had a dream that follows. He dreamt that his uncle Joseph, who was incarnated by his friend R, had a yellowish blonde beard. And in this dream, he was having sentiments of affection or loving sentiments towards his uncle. As he watched or observed his uncle, something shifted inside of him, and he felt like the face of his uncle was a little deformed. It was a little uncanny or unhinged. We can even take this uncanny feeling to an essay of Sigmund Freud called The Uncanny, but that's beyond the discussion for now. So Sigmund Freud makes an analysis of this dream. In this analysis, his friend R was representing his uncle Joseph. Let's start with the background history of this uncle Joseph and why Uncle Joseph is so important to this dream. Uncle Joseph was a Jewish man who, in the accounts of Sigmund Freud's father, was a very simple-minded man. And that takes relation to the fact that he ambitiously, and this is another signifier that we're gonna highlight, that ambitiously managed to scheme plan to assault someone or something and to gain more money. And that plan was duly punished by law. And due to that fact, Sigmund Freud considered his uncle, through the speech of his father, as a simple-minded man and also an ambitious man. And then he asks himself, what does it have anything to do with the anxiety provoked in the nomination? Well, he started to notice some similarities between his uncle and his friend R. In a sense, both of them were in a situation of possible social, economic, and political ascension. Also, and this is my interpretation, I believe that his friend R was Jewish, which by composition, which is a concept of Sigmund Freud's, would make these two figures align in a identification line of thinking. But Sigmund Freud also remembered another friend who had been in the same situation. This friend is called Anne, and Anne was in a similar situation, however, with a little bit of differentiation. Because in Anne's words, he wasn't officially effectuated in the position because he had been incriminated by a patient of his, allegedly accusing him of immoral conducts. And he states to Sigmund Freud in a manner to calm him that he would be effectuated in the position because Freud had an immaculate morality. But something triggers Freud to think even further of this dream. What troubles him the most is the affection sentiments towards his uncle. We can also trace, by composition, a similarity between the uncle and an R. I, in my interpretation, assume that all of them are Jewish. And why would I assume that? Because of the signifier that is repeatedly introduced in the narration, sectarian. To me, the cult the sectarian is trying to address is the Judaism. So in my interpretation, all of them, including Sigmund Freud, obviously, were Jewish. And all of them had also been in a position of possible political, social, and economic dissension. And then how the sentiments of affection towards his uncles plays any role in here. Freud was extremely disgusted by his colleagues and uncle. Disgusted because they were Jewish. However, and that is my interpretation, however, he couldn't consciously be aware of it because it would mean that he would also be disgusted by himself as a Jewish man. So in a mechanism of the unconscious that he entitles censorship, made the sentiments be understood in an inverse meaning. So actually Sigmund Freud wasn't feeling affection towards his uncle, but rather he was disgusted, repulsed, averse by his uncle. And so, therefore, disgusted by himself. And obviously, in my interpretation, I take this as not himself in a literal sense, but his status as a Jewish man. And because by being a Jewish man, he wouldn't be effectuated in the position that he so desperately wanted. So how can I enhance this proposition? And let's take to the second part of the dream, the beard. So let's note that Sigmund Freud was a physician. And the German translation for blonde beard is Golb. I'm sorry for my pronunciation. And Golb in German refers to yellowish, yellow, blonde, etc. But also there is a disease that is called Golb leap. And this disease is in the English translation is icteriasis, which is a disease that someone becomes a little yellowish. However, I take this in a more symbolic status. I take that Sigmund Freud understood that to achieve his goal of being effectuated in the position, he would have to whiten himself, meaning he would have to have an immaculate morality and also not be a simple-minded person. All of these strategies had only one goal: to make himself look white, to make himself recognized as a white man. And Sigmund Freud states in the narration of the dream that he had a disgusted feeling acknowledging that he was getting old, meaning due to the decay of youth, the decoloration of his beard from black to yellow, he would feel deeply troubled by it. And he identified the same anxiety or the same disgust in the face of his uncle. And again, symbolically, this is just, in my interpretation, a addressing to the fact that he had to whiten himself up so he would be recognized and possibly effectuated in his position. So this is my whole interpretation of this dream. And I wanted to sustain this interpretation citing two major thinkers. The first one is Neusa Souza, who was a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst here in Brazil. She published a book, yet to be translated, entitled Becoming Black, and she studies the symbolic price of ascension in people of color. I want to say people of color, understanding that white is a color, but just to make myself clearer, what I'm saying is everyone who's not white. So she studied the strategies of ascension in relation to those communities of non-white people. And she noticed that there were a few possibilities. One would be this megalomaniac attempt of being the best. Second would be the denial of traditions, the color scheme, the phenotypical figures, and the symbolic heritage. And the third one, who was the most efficient in her eyes in terms of possibilitating the integration of the subject to the ethnical group and also to instrumentalize him to ascend socially and economically, was becoming black. So black here is not necessarily in relation to solely black people, but Asian people, brown people, yellow people, and so forth. Becoming black means owning one's identity and to transfigurate, transvalorate new values, new modes of thinking, new modes of jouissance, new modes of being in the world, and not to despise the previous ones, but to create something anew from it. She takes this idea obviously from Nietzsche, and this is exactly what troubles Sigmund Freud. If we take two of the most cited books in Sigmund Freud's work, The Interpretation of Dreams, that are The Inferno of Dante Alighieri and also Faust of Goethe, we can see that on the second one, there is a doctor who is the symbol of reason, of science, of the Apollonic nature, that feels a little troubled by his essence of a mortal, limited man. And he then makes a deal with a demon that would grant him the possibility of the understanding of human nature and things in a more further way. And we can take as a metaphor for this doctor, Dr. Faust, the Sigmund Freud himself, and the demon, whiteness. Whiteness as an structural, ideological, and discursive phenomenon that would grant someone the possibility of being recognized, at the same time would oblige this person to pay for a significant symbolic price. So that is also used to sustain a proposition, but let's take another step further and invoke here Fanon's theory, especially explicited in white skins, black masks. So when we take black people and white people in Fanon terms, we're not taking the phenotypical figures and characters of a population, but rather in an ontological way. We are understanding that the whites are ontologically speaking the alibi for humanity, for recognition, for power. Whereas we are understanding the blacks, and here again, we're not referring only to the black community, but any ethnic community that has been colonized. We're taking this place of non-être, pas d'être, or if you will, of not being, not existing. This place that is of the slave in the Hegelian dialectics and so forth. So in the Freudian interpretation, and again, let's conceive the fact that Freud is experimenting and analyzes on dreams with the objective, with the intention, in an attempt of explaining or as stating, affirming that in every dream there would have realization of an unconscious desire. And in that specific dream, returning to the analysis of the dream, in the first analysis of the dream, Sigmund Freud states that the realization of the unconscious desire there was given in this proposition. If I'm not simple-minded and if I'm not immoral, then I would be considered to the job. However, in my interpretation, things get a little bit more political. I interpret as, if I'm not simple-minded as my uncle Joseph, if I'm not Jewish as my friend R, and if I'm not immoral as my friend Anne, then I would be recognized as a white man, and therefore my place would be granted. So we can see how my interpretation twisted a little bit Freudian's formula, but increasing the political elements. And then we can end for today's video. And in the second part of the video, we're going to address a little bit more of the Neusa Santos Souza discussion on the strategies of social, political, and economic ascension to the populations that are not white, and also how Fanon is absolutely crucial to my interpretation. And by the end, in the third part, we're going to discuss the second analysis of the same dream that Sigmund Freud himself did, stating that, in fact, and for a fact, all of those figures were indeed Jewish, and he would recover in his fantasies, primal fantasies, and primal childish desires, and even in his psychosexual impulses, or if you will, pulsions, that my interpretation is plausible. So let's end for now and expect the second and third part.